So here let's see how the entity control boundary need to identify. There are few rules we need to follow for identification of the entities. Let's see what are those. So we should know what they are. So they should represent the key data objects of the system. That is nothing but we know. They are typically persistent data which is stored to the database. And based on the characteristics, we need to identify the object. Each entity must have a unique ID that must logic related to their own data. That nothing but every email ID for the user is different, but the validation rule for the member is different. So there are usually independent of the user interface. So entity object should not be a user interface. Then where it is applicable. So there can be a people, it can be a places or maybe a things, which is comparable between any two things or two people or two places in our system that is care about. This is the way we need to identify the entity object. So let's move on to the identification of the boundary object. So what they are, the boundary object should represent there is an interface between the system and the actor. So this is we have already covered in the UML use case what you mean by the system and the actor indicates that nothing but it acting as a window into the system. Again, based on the characteristics of the object that may belong to the boundary object, so that should handle all the input and output of the system. That nothing but through the GUI or any web pages we can interact with by giving the input and what the response we are getting from the website. So it can be an application programming interface, or it can be a printer or even system notifications. They translate the user action into the system events. So where we can applicable the word what we give input from the keyboard or what result we see on the screen. So this is the mouse of our application. Any input or output statements it handles that comes under the boundary object. So what are the rules to follow for identification of the control objects? So what they are? They should represent the application logic between entity and the boundary objects. So there is a connectivity between the entity and the boundary is nothing but the control objects. They must coordinate between the behavior of multiple objects to fulfill a use case. So what are the characteristics? Based on the characteristics, we need to identify the control object. There should be a specific use case or it can be a set of related operations to manage the transactions. So those transactions will be handled with the flow workflows. So that is nothing but acting as a verb of the system. Means who will handle all these transactions? The verbs which act as where it is applicable, the brain of the system or the workflow of the manager should maintain all the flow of the work in order to process the request. So these will act as the control objects where they coordinate between the multiple systems of the main system. So when you look for the example of the library management system, we can borrow the book or we can return the book. So many operations can be performed with the library management system. So let's consider a use case called borrow a book. So how to identify the entity, boundary and control object for borrow a book use case. Let's have the object type is boundary, control and entity. And in the second column, it indicates what object which are related to the boundary and what is the responsibility of each object type. So let's take the boundary object. As we discussed, it handles the flow of the data. If the condition is satisfied, then statements will be executed, otherwise not. So those kind of flow of conditions will be handled by boundary. So specific to borrowing a book of the library management system, check out the screen, login screen and the printer and what are the email services. They can be example for the boundary object. What is the role of the boundary object? According with respect to borrowing a book, they will interact with the user and the external systems. That nothing but the interaction happens between the user and the system. What about the control object type? So what kind of flow? So first we'll request for the member, validate the member, book the data, validate the bookup, and then we will be giving the book record to the user. So what are the objects may belong to the control, borrow book controller and return book controller and search for the controller. What is the responsibility the control object handles? There will be a sequence of steps are involved in this. What are those sequence of steps? The first, he will get the member, validate the member, get the book, validate the book, and finally will be issuing the books. So there are a set of sequence of steps involved in order to control the object. Then how to identify the objects? It can be a member or it can be a book or based on the characteristics or the people or between any two things which are comparable will be considered as entity. That means it does not do the work itself. It can ask the specialized entity object to do it by communicating with other objects. So the responsibility of the entity object here, holding the core business data in the domain logic. That means calculating what is the fine and validate the member status, whether the book is already returned or it is issued by the particular user. So this gives the overall example of borrowing a book of the use cases of the library management system, indicates how to apply or how to identify the boundary, control and entity objects.